in today's episode, we're getting witchy. Seriously though, no matter the stance on spirituality in general, I think all solar punks can agree that working with other people to intentionally make the world a better place is a very good thing. I went into this interview knowing just about nothing when it comes to the exercise of pagan spirituality, but I ended up doing a visualization exercise and coming to a better understanding of what exactly solar punks like BrightFlame mean when they talk about solarpunk witchcraft. If you like what you hear today and want to support free, independent solarpunk content, give us a nice review on your podcatcher of choice. Every review bumps the algorithm and helps us reach even more like-minded people who might need a little solarpunk inspiration in their lives. If you're listening to us on YouTube, smash that like button, as they say, and give us a follow. If you really liked what we had to say in this or any other episode, consider sharing it with a friend or even supporting us financially if you're in a position to do so by heading over to patreon.com/solarpunkpresents. Okay, enough from me. On to the episode. Hi listeners, it's Ariel, and for this episode, I'm sitting down with BrightFlame, solarpunk author as well as a teacher and ritualist. Just some of her accolades include publications in the anthologies Solarpunk Creatures, Bioluminescent, and in Solarpunk Magazine, as well as global acclamation for the workshops that she leads, on top of being the co-founder for the Center for Sustainable Futures at Columbia University. She's also a member of the Climate Fiction Writers League, Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association, Brooklyn Speculative Fiction Writers, and Broad Universe, which is a United States-based, all-volunteer organization with the primary goal of promoting science fiction, fantasy, and horror written by women. Today, we're going to be discussing the way that she blends solarpunk and magical activism in her fiction, as well as a bit about her brand new, as yet unnamed, nonfiction book. BrightFlame, I am very honored to welcome you to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Before we begin, I give a rundown of some of your accomplishments and affiliations, but would you give listeners an introduction in your own words?
Sure. Well, I live on Lenape land on Turtle Island, in between so-called New York City and Philly, but in a rural area. And in fact, my partner and I tend the land we're on as a nature and native plant reserve, fostering regenerative forest in an area where that doesn't happen very often for deer browse and development and all of the above reasons. As a solar punk witch, as I describe myself, I write, teach, and make magic for just regenerative world. And much of my work, like teaching, and writing, and just living, is about justice and resilience. I want to point out, you mentioned Broad Universe. It supports speculative fiction writers who are women and historically excluded and marginalized genders. So not just cis women. Probably I wouldn't be part if it was exclusionary to only cis women these
Fair.
days. And my most recent story that came out is Ancestors Descendants in the Bright Green Futures anthology, edited by Susan K. Quinn. And I'm really thrilled to be among some wonderful authors who I've gotten to know through the years in that anthology.
That's awesome. I need to get my hands on that anthology because I'm very excited about the stories that are in it as well. So it kind of sounds like you are living a very nature-based life. You're involved in environmental activism, but I'm wondering, how did you first come to solar punks as we know it as a concept?
I'm part of, as we said, Brooklyn Speculative Fiction Writers, and one of our lead organizers, Cameron Robertson, who writes as Rob Cameron, first told me about Solarpunk back in about 2019. And I realized it described my spiritual tradition, my teaching, and the way I live. And so I'm like, yes, Solarpunk, that's me. So, I came up with I had been using that tagline about myself that I write, teach, make magic for just regenerative futures. And it was like, yeah, that is Solarpunk. So from that point, I began writing the futures that I had envisioned that are quite solar punk. They stem from a 2016-ish set of workshops that I co-authored with Starhawk, who's also a witch and an activist and an author of many books. And as part of the workshop, Starhawk led an immersive journey and a visualization to visit those futures we so desired. Very, very visceral. And I could taste that future where I found myself. It
Wow.
really stuck with me. So 3+ years later, I decided to start writing short fiction. My novel was already drafted by then through a very long process. It took actually more than a decade to write that novel. But the short fiction that I call my threads stories take place in that future at different points in time. And many of those stories have been published. Matter of fact, I'm collecting them into a mosaic novel that I'm pitching to try to get published. So, and then also my spiritual tradition is totally solar punk. I've been speaking with my fellow reclaiming tradition witches, which we're a global tradition, and talking about solar punk. And so many of them say, yeah, that describes us so well. So
Oh,
there we
wow.
go. And solar punk really just having the name and knowing there's a community of activists out there and writers out there working solar punk, and people creating solar punk projects really inspires me and brings me back to hope. Because even though I put hope out a lot and resilience, I'm not always there, right?
It's very truthful. I think that a lot of solar punks, we put out so much hope, but we don't keep that much for ourselves. And so it can be really refreshing to be among other solar punks who are generating that hope because you kind of, I mean, I feel like saying feed off of that hope sounds kind of sinister, but like like get that energy that maybe you aren't quite able to generate for yourself all the time.
And
Oh,
it's so much about mutualism and community that we don't always have to be up and on and real active because we're in community. And as long as we're cycling, through our own cycles of being way out there doing stuff and then, having some restorative time, and we're all doing it in not synchronous. So there's always some people doing the work very actively. That's how it works.
yeah, it's not all on and all off. It's some people are doing the activism while some people are taking a rest to, stave off burnout, or maybe they have burned out, but that's okay. And they're just taking some time for themselves. But that's okay because the work does continue because we're in community, right? I find that extremely comforting. You mentioned your spiritual tradition and how solarpunk is so like resonates with that. And I wondered about your spiritual tradition, if you wouldn't mind my asking, how did you first come to witchcraft? And was it always kind of about this regenerative future, about nature-based practice, or did you move towards that? Could you describe for me how that came about?
Yes. First of all, I should say to listeners that I'm a white presenting older woman. I have white hair. So when I talk about the years, it'll make sense to you. All right. So back in, like, let's say the 70s, I was part of just secular feminist movements, different circles, and began to feel like, no, there's a spiritual component. And I wasn't raised in any religious tradition particularly. I didn't have any ties to religion. Matter of fact, religion itself as an organized religion didn't so much make sense to me. I wasn't drawn to it, but spiritual stuff, like there just seemed to be more. And so I hooked up with some others and was part of some what we called goddess circles back then, creating ritual on the fly, just not knowing anything about how to, just doing whatever we felt drawn to, celebrating the earth, celebrating goddess and creatrix, kind of as opposed to a dominating male god. And then I wouldn't call that actual witchcraft, though, right? But that was kind of my spirituality through the 80s. I found out about the reclaiming tradition of witchcraft through a friend who said, we have these week-long intensives we call witch camps, and there's one starting on the East Coast. I was like, oh, wow, I'm going to go to that. And I fell in love. That was the first Vermont witch camp in 1995. And it was the first time I truly felt energy, that I truly felt like, okay, I'm learning how to sense and shape energy. I can do that. And so all these people can as well. And we're creating magic together. Magic is, to me, the way I define it is sensing and shaping energy.
Mm.
So many of the founders of the reclaiming tradition, which includes Starhawk, were there at that first camp. So I learned so much from these, shall I say, elders of our community, even though they weren't that much older than me, but they'd been practicing and developing this tradition. We're very much an evolving tradition. And I love that. It's also an ecstatic tradition, an activist tradition, a non-hierarchic tradition. That's what really sets us apart. We really try to center, at least striving to be anti-racist, anti-transphobic, anti-ableist, anti-fascist, all the things that Solarpunk also vibes with. And we work at it. That's the evolving part. New methods come to us, new ways of talking and being together, always striving to create resilient communities. And we're global tradition, so a resilient web of us all around the globe. So sounds very solar punk.
Yeah, for sure. This isn't a question that I wrote down, so forgive me. But I'm so interested because I know a little bit about the revival of witchcraft and 1970s feminism. And I'm wondering, when you talk about reclaiming witchcraft, was there a type of witchcraft that I guess was the original witchcraft that you were going from, and then reclaiming that? And why did it need to be reclaimed? And what is bound up within that name there?
Well, if you talk to any of the founders of my tradition, you'll get different answers about why the word reclaiming. So it's reclaiming our own authority, our own embodied power. Even though there are some traditions that claim to have a through line from ancient times all the way forward, mostly out of Europe, witchcraft traditions, maybe, I don't know. And it's not so much looking to reclaim an ancient particular practice. It's about reclaiming our way of being with nature, being part of nature, reclaiming power within as opposed to power over. That's a loaded word, reclaiming. So it's
Yeah, for
it's
sure.
really it's reclaiming our own authority, reclaiming our ability to work with the unseen, with guides, with allies, with ancestors, with various gods, with mysterious ones. And God, when I say gods, I'm talking about gendered and ungendered gods, because our evolving tradition, many folks work with trans gods and ungendered gods and whoever comes through. So yeah.
I have a lot of questions about that, but also I don't want to derail this too much into just the Ariel asks questions time. So I want to talk about your book, The Working. It's a solarpunk fiction novel that revolves around a coven of witches who are battling a pipeline through magical means, and we, the readers, quickly find out that the pipeline is just the tip of the existential iceberg, and we have to follow our coven members as they deal with it on and off of the astral plane. So it's really solar punk. It's grounded in the modern day, but extremely cognizant of humanity's impact on the Earth and the necessity for the humans who are interested in protecting her to rise up and fight fossil fuels and other destructive industries and even societal values such as individualism that separate us from each other and from flora, fauna, and the Earth itself. Is that accurate?
That's a wonderful explanation of my book. I love how you phrase it. I want you to go out and do an ad someplace for me with that. The only thing I would point out, and I do this myself without realizing and have to correct myself about it, I really strive to use subjective pronouns for all
Mm,
our earth kin. So when you say the earth itself, I prefer the earth themselves. You know, when I talk about forest and trees, it's them. I don't often know an earth kin's gender. Maybe sometimes I do. So I more often use them than I use she or he, talking about our non-human kin on the planet. But
right.
language has power.
It does.
Yeah.
It does. And thank you for calling me out on that. As you can see, like, I mean, like, I make a lot of effort towards, trying to change my language around this kind of stuff, but it sneaks in because I've grown up in a society that has socialized me to objectify the earth and animals and flora and fauna, anything that's not human, objectifying even some humans, right? And so it's just so insidious the way that this language comes out because it really does reflect your worldview and maybe even your subconscious worldview. So thank you for calling me out on that. 'Cause I think that's a really good point. And we're all trying and we're all sort of trying to fail forward.
Yeah, yeah. I try to model it in all the various interactions that I have. You know, whether it's a local zoning board meeting where people look at me funny when I'm saying that the trees, them, you know,
Yeah.
or in my witch communities, my writing communities.
Yes, naming something has a lot of power. And as you pointed out, like language has a lot of power because our language just kind of is so intrinsically tied with who we are and what our culture says we should be. So, one thing I was curious about was the magical activism that you wrote about in The Working. So, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts about integrating both magical activism and solarpunk elements into your fiction. And there is power in words. That definitely comes through. So, I would love to hear you talk more about that.
Well, one of the reasons I wrote The Working, but a secondary reason, because the first reason really was my ancestors pushing me with some teachings that come through the elders in the story, and truly trying to find out what the working is that can shift, or at least what is one working that can shift the world towards what we need and what we want, because we're headed towards true catastrophe if we don't shift things right on this
Right.
planet. So that was really the first impetus. And by the way, I didn't know what the working was until very late in drafting this. And the working
Oh.
is a real thing. Talk about magical activism. But besides that, the other impetus was that students of mine have been saying, write a craft book, a witchcraft book with your flavor of the craft. I'm like, I prefer reading fiction myself. So I wove into the working real magical practice. I put in there some of the exercises that we use in reclaiming or that I use in my work that are kind of just basic how to work with energy, how to work with yourself in an embodied way. So it kind of is a book of shadows in a way, like hidden within the working. So there's
Right.
that. But also, the magical activism elements in the book are very real. Both what the coven does on the astral, which is the unseen realm, the realm that we might say is adjacent to what we consider the mundane realm. Some call it the ancestor realm, but it's a place where everything is energy and pure potential. So you can work and shift things in that realm that are not as easy to shift in the plane of tangibleness that we consider common reality. So the coven both works there, as I do, and as many witches do, and they work in the streets as activists. Plenty of it, like going to protests and chanting, going to
Yeah.
protests and leading a spiral dance. Those are all ways of shifting energy, and it's all magical activism as well. If you go to a street protest, for instance, and let's say it's a big march
Yeah.
and it's kind of getting stuck, and maybe the police are starting to corral people in with those barriers, right?
Mm.
And you end up with a glob of people just stuck.
Yeah.
How do you shift that? Maybe people are all getting nervous, or maybe the energy is getting very frenetic,
Uh-huh.
and you might have some people starting to do things that won't be very aligned with getting what we want. Starting, like often our folks carry drums in the streets. So starting a chant, trying to get everybody to start chanting, and then having people join up in a big circle as much as they can and beginning to lead a spiral dance, which my tradition's kind of known for these spiral dances, which I describe one in the book. That helps cohere the energy. It
Mm.
helps kind of bring people together into commonality to be more effective. So
Ah,
that's
okay.
one way of magical activism.
So
And
it's
even just chanting, trying to sustain chants. I know
yeah.
lately I've gone to some protests where the people with the megaphones, who are kind of the organizers, do like 3 rounds of a chant and then just stop.
Mm.
And you could feel, whether you're a witch or not, you could feel like, okay, we're gonna, well, it just stops.
Right.
And it's energy, it's all energy. So learning how to sense that. Like we all walk around sensing energy. You sense when you're too close to people, like you start
Mhm.
to get into their personal space, and your whole body's telling you, oh, no, that's their personal space, back off. You know when you get uncomfortable when others come into your personal
Yeah,
space.
it's kind of
That's
like a magnetic field. You sort of feel repelled almost or
Yeah, and
drawn
that's
in.
all energy. And so being a witch is just staying more aware of that, learning to notice, to
Okay.
observe, and then also learning how to shift energy as
Oh,
we will for
interesting.
whatever the reason. So yeah, did I answer that question?
Yeah, yeah. No, I think I really enjoyed the scenes where the witches would go out to sort of like protest and interact with everyday people and like or people who were part of the coven or part of the magical tradition. And like the commentary that you made on energy. Solarpunk's all about community, and we talk about how to sort of maintain community and like there's, shared values and shared beliefs and shared goals. And it sounds like shared energy and going to protest and manipulating the energy. That's kind of like crowd control almost, just kind of making sure that everybody's sort of vibing on the same wavelength, I guess. That makes sense. That I think that was a very good answer.
There's very overt ways of doing like that, like the examples I gave you, the chanting and the drumming and the
Yeah.
spiral dance, but there's also some other ways we have, subtle or covert ways we have, even out in the streets. Like you can imagine, how a drain works in a sink, and
Hmm.
how, at least in this hemisphere, the water cycles counterclockwise to go down, I guess counterclockwise to go down the drain. You can work energy and set a drain when there's a lot of stuff that's
Hmm.
not healthy stuff and it would be better to clear it. You can set an energetic drain. And you could
Interesting.
just do that unobtrusively. It's not like people are noticing you doing this thing. So that's an example of other kinds of
Yeah,
magical
those
activism.
those kind of examples do crop up in the book as well. I mean, like when protagonists or characters, I loved, by the way, how you switched between the voices of each protagonist and with different chapters. So we got to see a little slice of what was going on in everybody's life and, their inner thoughts and what they really felt about the other members of the coven and stuff like that. But also, when we're following them around singularly, they do a lot of this sort of subtle kind of energy manipulation, which I found really interesting because they use it for the benefit of others, for the benefit of themselves, certainly, because they are part of the community of others in that room or wherever they are. But it's also just to, calm people down or, like focus their energy towards doing something. So I like the idea of doing something like that without selfishly trying to manipulate people to only benefit yourself, but realizing like, oh, the energy here is just kind of too frenetic and kind of off, like, and everybody is sort of feeling awful. And so I'm going to do something about that and try and make everybody feel better so that we can, actually come together and have this talk about like the pipeline. That
We
certainly,
witches do a lot of grounding, grounding
yeah,
and
yeah.
centering.
Emotions certainly do run high when you're talking about, fossil fuel projects and such. So,
We
uh,
have an expression in reclaiming, you're your own authority rooted in community.
mm,
And the rooted in community part was evolved into that saying because it's very much about, you have your own power and authority, power within like a healthy form of power, learning what that is, but you're also rooted in community. So for the good of the community, keeping your intention for the community, not just for yourself when it's not aligned with community.
right. Yeah, and that's always a good thing to keep in mind, I think, as opposed to the individualism that not only is self-aggrandizing, but also cuts you off from other people. I was wondering, just because the working is just so full of all of this advice about magical rituals and activism, and I was wondering if there are any protocols for the communication of like magical activism that you had to be aware of when you were writing. There's certain things that maybe you didn't write down because you're not allowed to talk about it, or like I'm not familiar at all with the practice, so I really have no idea. I'm just not just asking on behalf of the listeners.
Well, there's not a huge amount of like secrets in our tradition. Part of that is being a non-hierarchic tradition. Even though there are initiations available in our tradition, it's not a prerequisite, and that's not part of being a reclaiming witch. It's just a private thing someone might want to do for themselves, not a hoop you have to jump through to get to any level, because we strive for not having levels such as that. It's all I've learned through the years. It's all about trusting yourself and trusting your ability to work with this stuff. It starts with imagination
Hmm.
because if you can imagine it, it can be manifest. And everything is energy, right?
Hmm.
Whether it's something tangible like this cup I'm holding or my body, or just the subtle energies around that you can kind of sense with your body, but you can't see or touch necessarily. So it's learning to imagine, to come up with an intention, because I practice and most in my tradition practice and come up with your intention and then craft what you're going to do around the intention so that you have a focus, right? So you have an intention, then it's playing with that, like, and trusting that what you're doing is creating change, and you can do it on your own, you could do it with others. So let's play with an example and I'll
Oh,
show you that
okay.
even you can do it. Right. So let's use the example of The U.S. Congress,
Hmm.
that's a mess. That's
Right.
like, I don't want to even put adjectives on what's going on in the U.S.
Yeah.
Congress right now, but what would it look like? Like, let your mind just go, your imagination go. What's a caricature of Congress? Something that'll encapsulate the energy of the Congress right now for you. Like, just what pops into your mind, some
Hmm.
objects, some cartoons, some.
Hmm. Well, disclaimer, I am Canadian, so it's going to be
Oh,
an interesting,
oh, right,
or
right, right.
perhaps different
Yeah.
caricature or cartoon. Huh.
Or even as this president of the US is trying to affect Canada, like what comes to
Right.
mind,
Okay.
caricature wise.
Do I have to say it out loud or should I keep it to my
Yeah, say it. No,
Okay.
say it out
All right.
loud.
All right. Out loud. In regards to the whole sovereignty business and tariffs, I would say, so Disney's Beauty and the Beast, Gaston. Um,
Which one's Gus?
he is the kind of rapey guy who like tries to get married to Belle through any means
Oh,
possible
okay.
and doesn't listen to her and doesn't bother learning about what she likes or learning about what she's interested in or even having a decent conversation with her. Just wants, like she's a trophy that he wants to own. So that is the caricature
Yeah.
that is coming to mind in the situation of this
Yeah.
whole situation.
Yes. That makes a lot of sense. So,
Yes.
what would you do magically, energetically, in a fun way? Let your imagination go. Picture here's Gaston.
At this point, BrightFlame is holding up a hand and gesturing to it as if it is holding something. Mm-hmm.
What would you picture like doodling a drawing or something? What would you do to cut off Gaston's access, to siphon off his power, to thwart Gaston? And picture it almost as a cartoon, like where anything's possible. It doesn't have to be something you can physically actually do.
Okay, does it have to be like multiple actions or
No,
like a single
no,
action?
just anything that pops.
Okay, all
Yeah.
right. Probably shrink him.
Oh, okay.
You know?
So, here's a
If
magical activism thing, right? You're
yeah.
gonna take Gaston as the caricature of the, if I could say, asshole in power in the US, and you're gonna have grounded and centered yourself so that you have good energy running, good in the sense of full energy running in your energy field. And then you might even cut out a picture of Gaston or draw a picture of Gaston or say, okay, this leaf represents Gaston, anything to represent Gaston. And then you're literally gonna, like, well, figuratively or literally, gonna shrink it. Like maybe Gaston is this wad of aluminum foil, and you're gonna make it smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until it's just a little wee thing, and then you're gonna like throw it in, I don't know, bury it, or
Mm.
throw it in boiling water or something, or something that represents shrinkage to you.
Okay.
Um, maybe it's cutting a fabric image out and then boiling it in hot water so it literally shrinks to
Mm.
down to nothing. Or maybe it's just using your imagination and you're not working with a tangible thing. Maybe it's just going "Nee, nee," with your hands if people can't see. I'm using my hands to make shrinking motions as if I'm holding a ball that's Gaston and I'm making it smaller and smaller and
Mm.
smaller and smaller until poof, it's gone.
Hmm.
Okay? That's
Okay.
magical activism.
Oh, okay. And so that's taking that energy that I'm feeling coming from the US Congress and kind of like minimizing it in my life am I minimizing it in real life, or is this mostly for me, or mostly on sort of behalf of a community? Like, how far does the activism reach?
Well, that's the trust part. The more we do these things and the more we get together and do it in community, the more power and effect it has. Okay.
Okay.
So I've been with groups of witches working on the astral. Things become more powerful on the astral, more effective because that's the place where everything is energy and everything is possible. So I'll give you the example of the US Congress that I was moving towards. Something's rotten in the US Congress, right?
Mm.
So picture being in the realm of the unseen, accessing the area below the physical building,
Okay.
and just take an imaginative journey and look for the rot. Look for where that rot's coming from
Right.
and use your imagination of what are you going to do to get rid of the rot. It might be using a fire torch to burn it out, or it might be clipping with garden shears or, whatever, or it might be growing something fresh and new to cover the rot and eat the rot.
Huh.
It might be invoking fungi to eat the rot. It's all those kinds of things. And there's plenty of examples of that kind of magic in the working.
Yeah, for sure. Are you comfortable with sharing any stories of magical activism that you've participated in? Like, is it something that you have done by yourself, or if it's with a coven and multiple magical practitioners who are working on it together? I was really impressed by that scene in The Working where they work to reverse a power outage. I'm not going to spoiler it too much, but it's very dramatic. And I really enjoyed it because it was just a sense of community and a shared goal among a lot of people who don't really know each other. So I'm interested in if you're comfortable with sharing a story of your own magical activism and sort of what happened.
Yes, and before I do that, I want to also say that doing work on the astral or magical activism doesn't take away of doing the work in the mundane,
Mm,
right? So it just helps enhance the other. Working in the astral for me and for others really enhances what's happening with all the protests and rallies and whatever in the real world for people who don't know anything about magic. It's not just do that instead
okay.
of doing,
Oh no,
the
that
other.
makes
So I want to,
sense. That
yeah.
makes sense. It's very
Uh,
much like you can't just like in like visualizing is big nowadays. Like you can't just visualize a thing, you have to go out and do it
right.
afterwards. The visualizing helps you do the thing, but you gotta actually do the thing.
Exactly, exactly. So the example I gave you about the rot under Congress is very similar to what I've actually done with a group of witches. Um, there's so much. Some
Mm,
of it I've done alone, some of it I've done in groups. I've been at witch camps where we are raising energy and raising it. I don't even remember the theme of the particular witch camps, but we might be raising energy that'll really shake something or other. And right after there was thunder and lightning for real, like right
mm.
after we raised this energy.
Oh wow.
Um, or another example, I've been at a witch camp where we did some magic and we had our ritual, and then there was a giant shooting star across the sky. So, maybe coincidence, maybe not. In a recent witch camp this year, our intention, we usually state the theme and the intention. This particular theme mentions the storms and the thunder and lightning, whatever. Well, there was a giant power outage that shortened our whole
Mm.
witch camp. Maybe invoking storms isn't a great idea. Magic and working with energy has an effect in the world. The quantum physics tells us that these days.
Yeah, that's very true. I think setting that intention and thinking about it, and especially when you're in community and you're, all sharing this intention and this goal of changing something, then it sounds like that's a very effective way to translate into later action, right? Because that helps you set your own intention, but in the context of the group. Yeah.
Yeah, we work by consensus, which is sometimes a harder road or a longer path, but
Mhm.
it's really important. And often, at least for me, the coming up with what our intention is the longest part of the project, of whatever we're doing. Coming up with the intention might take, I don't know, an hour of visioning together and coming up with whatever, and then it takes like 15 minutes to create a ritual based on
Mm.
that intention. I'm just throwing out the numbers, but
Oh,
something like that.
cool. I am going to switch a little bit because your next book, which is still to be named, is nonfiction. So why do you decide to switch genres in this way?
Well, as I said, I prefer reading fiction,
Mhm.
which is why my first book is a novel, even though a lot of this stuff, real stuff, is embedded. But I've been teaching a lot about solarpunk witchcraft. I have a set of workshops that participants tell me that they really love them and they've helped them do the work in the world. They've helped them get unstuck. They've given them hope, gives them a way forward. These workshops have been described as a how-to manual or instruction manual, and I want these tools to be available to a wider audience. So this book is about solarpunk witchcraft. Because even though I describe my tradition as being very solarpunk, not everyone, even in the reclaiming tradition, knows about solarpunk. And certainly outside of our tradition, other pagan traditions may not have heard of solar punk or may not be activist traditions, may not be as aligned with nature as our reclaiming witches. So I felt like, I really need to get this work out to a wider audience. Fun fact, or
Mhm.
maybe secret,
Oh,
the working is divided into 5 sections I call
right.
phases. That's a solar punk narrative arc that will be the bones of my nonfiction book.
Oh, really?
It's the bones of those 5 phases are the arc I work within that the solar punk workshops that I'm offering. So that's how the book will be laid out.
Oh, very cool. I was going to ask, would you say this new book is a continuation or backstory of a sorts to the working, like a companion piece or a whole new entity?
Well, companion and standalone. Some people prefer reading nonfiction, for instance, but you don't need to have read one to read the other. They're not dependent on each other, but they're nice companions. Yeah.
Sounds
Uh,
like structurally they're companions, in terms of that narrative arc. And I'm interested to see how that's going to sort of translate into nonfiction and nonfiction sections. Could you tell me what you want this new book to cover? I know you're at the very beginning of this, so I am asking, like, can you give us a sense of the topic? Just very vaguely, like very much like this is my intent for the book, if you're willing to share.
well, my intention, I haven't come up with a crisp intention statement, but
Mm.
my intention is something about helping people tilt towards hope and create change in the world, to offer inspiration and practice, like how to do things. It steps off with hope and desire. What do we desire? What are we hoping for? And that leads to an intention to act. Then the book picks up into the 5 sections of, okay, well, what can we do? How do we do it? A lot of exercises embedded in it, anecdotes, including from those who've taken the workshops with me, and maybe a little storytelling woven in. I haven't yet written that part, but a lot of embodied practice, a lot of what is energy, how do you sense energy, which is a very basic thing to witchcraft. So starting with that, and then moving through things like how do we relate with nature that we are part of? How do we work in a decentered way, so both as individual and as nature
Mm,
themselves? How do we know what's so-called right action? How do we know what path we're on? How do we step off onto this path? And what are methods we can do to be effective in this path? And those five phases, or the five structural bones of this, are really a spiral. In the workshops I've done, it's a pentacle working, which is something we do in the reclaiming tradition and other traditions, where we run a pentacle in our bodies. You know, the Vesuvian man, the Da Vinci, the
oh yeah, the
spread out
Vitruvian Man. Yeah,
person.
yeah.
Yeah. So your head is a point of the pentacle, as are your hands and your feet. And you literally feel the energy running or sense the energy running from
Mm,
point to point in a
okay.
particular pattern. So that's one tool, one way of working with those five points. That'll definitely be in the book also.
Cool. Well, I'm looking forward to it. I was wondering, Bright Flame, do you have any advice that you would give to listeners who were interested in solar punk and magical activism? Where would you go to suggest they learn more in the absence of this nonfiction book coming out?
Read the working.
Yeah.
Plug my book because I embed so much real stuff. It's tagged as contemporary fantasy, mostly for those not in the know. I call it fabulist, which is the white person version of magical realism,
Hmm.
which magical realism is really the Latin or Latinx diaspora's way of working resistance fiction, talking about the world as they experience the world. So mine is fabulous. I've embellished a little bit, but not a lot. You know, most of the stuff in the working is real, and the working itself is real. It's something that I've offered in workshops, but it's a practice that what comes to me from the ancestors is that the more people running the energy of the working, the more healthy will be the web of life, and the more will tip towards a regenerative world in a way that we're not at the moment.
Yeah.
So, so yeah, there's that. And I want to give a shout out to Starhawk, who's a dear friend and mentor. Her writing is phenomenal. Her workshops are phenomenal. She's now serializing her latest book
Oh,
that's
really?
free in Substack, The Movement We Need. And she's got a podcast that goes along with that. And, you know, supporting her work through monetary contributions is really lovely because this is how Starhawk makes a living. And she does so much for the world. But also, there is magical activism in that body of work. She offers Instagram. I'm not on Facebook and Instagram that much these days. I'm only there because I have a book out and I kind of feel like I should keep up some level of presence in those places. But everybody, my preferred is Blue Sky, where I'm at BrightFlame, and on Mastodon, where I have real conversations
Mm,
with people. And I think in Instagram, Starhawk does a weekly trance visualization thing with everybody. She usually brings in some form of magical activism into that. I think they're Fridays early in the day in US time zones.
okay. Cool. Yeah, that's definitely something that listeners who are interested in this should go check out then, it sounds like. And how about yourself, Bright Flame? Where on the internet can we find you?
Okay, so the Blue Sky that I mentioned. My website is brightflame.com with lots of resources. There's some of my stories, links to the stories that are online that you could read for free. Lots about the working. And also I have a blog there that I also usually create a doodle to go along with it, what I call a doodle, because I'm not a trained artist. So
Mm.
you'll get to see some of my doodles and my writing and my blog. There's also a section there about great reads, which lots of climate fiction, solarpunk, ho-punk, diverse futurism books that I've recommended. So yeah, definitely my website. I also off of there have a newsletter, which is very occasional, different from my blog. And then I'm in on Mastodon, which is the Fediverse, for those who know what that is, the distributed social platform that's very solar punk.
Mhm.
I'm in Wandering.shop,
Oh.
which I thought, well, why is it called that? Is it some kind of shopping? No, it's the science fiction and fantasy writer instance that somebody created. So I'm in Wandering.shop at BrightFlame. And yeah, Facebook and Instagram, but Blue Sky is my preferred. All those are on my website.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We'll be putting that in the description for this podcast. And I wanted to thank you so much for sitting down with me and answering all of my bombardment of questions. You're very gracious.
Well, thank you, Ariel. And this was so much fun. And thank you for playing along with me, putting you on the spot of you coming up with what you would do with magic
Oh,
and
well, thank
activism.
you for running that little exercise. That was really fun. That's it for this week. Stay solar punk, everybody. Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents, a podcast hosted and produced by Ariel Kroon and Christina De La Rocha. The audio for this episode was recorded in part on the traditional territory of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, and in Germany. The opening and closing music for this podcast is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol, available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License. Don't forget to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/solarpunkpresents. Every little bit helps us keep bringing you discussions and interviews. Until the next episode, keep dreaming. And stay solarpunk.